Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today's March 30, 2025. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. Please subscribe. Also want to thank Doug Harvey for introducing me to today's guest, Mary Anna Pomonis. Where in the heck you calling in from, Mary Anna?
Los Angeles, California.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Probably time. I think that the space and the time, giving yourself space and time to be fully present is the most important thing. As I'm sitting out here, I'm in my garage, which most people don't think of a garage as a viable creative space. But for me, obviously, you can see behind me how messy it is. It is where I spend a large majority of my time. For most people, it's a space that's pretty empty, but I can hear the birds outside. I can experience really fully this moment by just being present in this time. And I think that for me, I'm very grateful for the time that I have. My mother died when I was very young, and I watched her die. And so I watched her deteriorate from 8 to 10. And she made me very conscious and aware that time is limited. And so for whatever reason, from that day forward, from the day that she passed forward, I really felt like there was a sort of clock ticking in the background behind my life. And that I had to make sure that I had as much of a life as I could within the time that I was allotted, which looking back on that now is a really weird thing to feel pressured about as a child. But it did make me very grateful for the time that I have.
Wow, you are sharp. That was amazing what you just said. It covers so much. And right off the bat, I live in a two-door garage in Venice, California for 45 years. So all the power to garages.
Well, you can adjust space, right? Because space is something that I had a really awesome studio for a while that was just on the front porch of a little apartment. It was like the first place I lived in LA, which was I was living with my sister in Brentwood, and there was no place to actually have a studio in that little place. But we had this little porch area that was outside, and it was just enough area to have a drawing table set up, and there was good light, and I could paint outside. And it worked great until my neighbors complained and I was breaking the homeowners rules or something.
Wow.
But and so then my space was the kitchen table, right? And so, but there was always, you can make space work, you can make it happen or figure out within your limitations. Your space can be a picnic table, if that's what you have to work with. But time you can't replace. Time is something that has to be present for you to be really invested in the time that you have.
It is so articulate, so concise, really cool. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
Well, and that's a hard question. I don't know that the body distinguishes information in its form. And that's something that's been that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Just because I think that paintings are text. No matter what we say, they are text. They're a form of visual communication. And because I primarily make paintings, but I'm also, reading and listening to books constantly. I believe that as an artist, you have to constantly be researching and looking for deeper meaning, and that all of those things come to you in lots of different avenues, and the text can come from many different directions all at the same time. So I think you have to be open and you have to be reading and looking constantly for information. So that does mean that I do live in a highly mediated environment, and I think that it would be probably in any other century or time completely impossible. But because I am constantly in my car a lot of my day, when I'm traveling to work or I'm traveling to be here, or I'm in my space and I'm trying to use time, I'm constantly trying to absorb and mediate the experience while still being present, which is just complicated.
Yeah.
But I do think that is what allows me to do the research that I need to do is I listen to a lot of the books that I read in my car. And so I used to just read only straight and not listen to books in the car and listen to music, but I shifted a couple of years ago to listening to books so I could read more. And it's amazing how much more I've been able to read during the time that I have. And so I love reading so much that to me, it's a much more interesting meditative space than just listening to music, although I do listen to music a lot as well. But I feel like when I am reading a good book or listening to a good book, it activates my imagination in a way that I can't really describe. So I often listen to books and read them at the same time so that I can shift into modality depending on where I am. Um, so I don't know that there's more or less. I think it's just ways of accessing information. And so, for example, when, written language first appeared, people were very afraid that it was going to ruin storytelling because there wasn't a job for a storyteller anymore to go from village to village and tell the story. But we didn't stop telling stories. We just wrote them down. I mean, so writing it didn't fundamentally change the need to tell or to share stories in the same way that having a video to listen and look at the same time doesn't change our need to experience the stories in order to understand existence. I just think that we have different labels for them depending on what era we were born in. But the primary form is communication, and it doesn't matter which modality you're in. If you're communicating, you're communicating.
Really good. Did you become a reader, one, because your parents told you to, two, they did it as an example, or three, on your own?
I became a reader through hard fought, I would say, specialized instruction. I did not want to learn how to read because I was a very verbal child and it was difficult for me. And I remember starting school and everyone could read and I couldn't. And I was just very frustrated to be grouped in a low group of students. And it was maybe kindergarten or first grade. And I was really angry about it because I thought it was this mark that I was unintelligent. And I was a hyper-verbal child and was verbal very young. My daughter was the same way when she was young. So when I had to shift from talking to accessing information remotely through my eyes, or not remotely, but in a different modality through my eyes, it was tremendously confusing for me. I learned later that I have a form of dysgraphia, which is not unlike dyslexia, but it's slightly different. It's more numbers oriented, but it's definitely stress induced. So, I just had a hard time understanding that the image on the letter wasn't an object, that it was instead a phonemic. There was some connection to noise that was associated with it. It just took a long time for my brain to make the switch. And I had an incredibly patient mother who sat with me through my frustrations and anger about it, and just was patient and said, "Oh, no, you're going to get it. Everybody does. It just takes some time. Be patient with yourself." I remember we were arguing about whether or not I was able to read. And I was making a case that I was just not within my capability to read. And I was like really a bossy little kid. And she held up a can. I remember it was like a can or a tube of A&D cream. And she said, "Read what this says." And I said, I can't read it. I don't know what the word is. And she said, "You know what that letter is, don't you?" And I said, "A." And then she said, "You know what that letter is, D." And she said, "You just read it. Like it's in your mind that you can't read. And if you can break through the block and just pay attention to what's right in front of you, you actually know how to read already." And I remember that moment feeling so surprised that she, to my small mind, like a 5-6-year-old imagination, she sort of blew my mind. And so I just kept trying. Once I learned how to read, though, I was so grateful for the ability to read because I'd felt so dumb for so long, because I had a sister that was a year younger than me that picked it up very quickly. And I was the opposite. It took me forever. Once I learned how, I remember I discovered that you could check out 14 books at the library, and I made it my goal in elementary school. While my mother was still alive, I checked out 14 books every time we went to the library because that was the max you could get. So I would stuff my book bag with as many books as I could, and I would read them all. I would just read them straight. I was weird about it. And I remember actually reading through the archaeology shelf in the children's library, every single book, because I was really into Egyptology for whatever reason when I was like 7 or 8. And, I just was determined that because I had lost time, that I was going to catch up and read more than everyone else. And later on, when, if by 5th grade, no one remembered anything about me, that I had struggled to learn to read to begin with, because by that time I was reading books and reading constantly. And it sort of made me actually kind of a weird kid, because I was much more interested in reading and using my imagination than I was in maybe socializing with other kids or playing. And so I was definitely more of a house cat as a kid than somebody who was like tinkering or building. I was reading and imagining and drawing. So I was inside a lot. And even when I was outside, the excuse would be that the light was better or something. It was never about really being social around other people. I am a very extroverted social person, but it took me a while to come out from behind the books in order to be myself, and to trust that people were going to be okay. And I think a lot of that was just, childhood trauma.
Boy, you really suss these out so well. This is really what I seek when I have these dialogues. So thank you. And you bringing up your mom evoked my mom. She had this great line: "God, give me patience and give it to me now."
That's awesome.
So, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
I think that's why we stand upright. We want to gather and collect everything we can. And, so I think it's just a compulsion. It's a totally neurotic compulsion that we have to, learn or to collect and do more constantly. I think if you take everything away from people, even pencils, pens, there's going to be this need and desire to collect information about the environment. It's wired into our DNA to collect information and look for it. It's that joy of discovery, right? So it's something we need to do. And I think actually it's something that people are fighting against in this environment, which is the mediated environment, is that without the incentive to look, people tend not to, right? Unless they're stuck in a situation where they are lost and without any company or anything around them, then they have to look for information. They have to search for things. But the desire comes from the lack of.
Amazing. You also evoked there, Matt Groening, pre The Simpsons, did a cartoon, Blinky, and the kid's playing with a plastic gun. And the mom comes out and says, "I don't want you playing with war toys." So she takes it away from him. Then he runs outside and picks up a stick and goes, "Pew, pew, pew."
Right.
So he's picking. So do you think this need or want, you sort of covered this, but I really am curious. Do you think this need or want to collect or gather information is more innate or more invented?
Oh, I think it's absolutely innate. I think, it's just part of who we are as creatures on this planet. I mean, we want, why do we collect information and then share it? I mean, those two things are very important to our survival, right? So we collect it and then we want to share it immediately with somebody. And so the first person we share it with, of course, is ourselves. We have to, think about our thinking, right? That's the power of metacognition, is thinking about our own thinking. But then in order for it to be real, we have to tell somebody.
Do thoughts create emotions?
I don't know. That one I don't know. I don't know maybe emotions are thoughts. They're just thoughts in their most crude form. They're gut level thoughts. They're maybe not articulate ones, but they're a form of thought. They're just maybe a kind of a potentially all controlling thought form. And I think thought forms are, both emotional and then they're also societal. So they're things that happen internally with us that we feel, that are maybe telegraphing something that's broader and wider that we don't quite understand. And then we slowly understand them. And then I think that they happen collectively. In Greece, there's this concept called the egregore, which an egregore is a socialized thought form. And so when we say things like the spirit of the city or the spirit of the epoch or the zeitgeist, what we're really talking about is a kind of group hallucination, an emotional thought form that's sort of transmitted across minds in an area, a specific geographic location. And, those things, I think, it's just like when you move into a crowd and everybody is feeling the same way, you feel that feeling amplified and you participate in it and you're a part of that greater thought form. And so you have to, think about what feelings you're trying to cultivate when you're going into community and what community you're going into, because you're opening yourself up to those thought forms. And so you have to be willing to participate in that in order for it to exist. And so I do think about that, like when I'm moving into communities, like what's the purpose of this community and this interaction? And am I going to be able to process the feelings, thoughts, and emotions that are going to come at me? Am I prepared to do that? So that I come into it with my own sense and consciousness, so I can step back from whatever the overwhelming feeling is in order to be myself in the situation. Because I work, so I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm a professor at Cal State Fullerton. I'm an assistant professor of art education. So even though I'm known as a painter, and that's my primary form, what I teach in my classroom is how to teach artists to think about thinking. So how do you, as an artist, walk into a room and ask people to think about their thinking in order to make something new? Right. And so that becomes more and more interesting the more you go into communities that are different and unlike you, and also like you, because we're all human. So you have to center yourself, understand what you're coming in to share, and then be open to sharing what's in the room with you in order to react together, so that the emotions are something that you're orchestrating maybe a little bit as a teacher, but they're all in service to the greater goal, which is to teach people to tap into their creative energy. And in a lot of the situations that I walk into with my students, they're situations where people don't have a lot of freedom. Like it might be an incarceration facility. So it might be a prison, a youth detention facility, or a high school. It could be a number of different locations, an Alzheimer's center, so there are situations that people are stuck in community with each other, maybe for a while, for the hour that they have this class. And we're walking into class and we're going to be participating in and reacting to big feelings that people have. Sorry, I'm going to turn off my phone. I should have done that before this.
No worries. It gives me a chance to ask you, how do you spell that Greek word? A-G-R?
Egregore, E-G-R,
E-G-R.
E-G-O-R-E. So it's a Greek word that means spirit of the city, right? But it also is as a word that when you look it up, it's going to pull up all of this stuff that's witchcraft related too, because people talk about the egregore as spell casting. So if you are interested in moving the spirit of a community, how do you do that? As an artist, as a person. And so it's used in witchcraft, but it's an ancient Greek idea.
Wow. The other thing is, Mariana, I really appreciate you says, I don't know. I'm welcome people saying, I don't know. I can't answer that. I'm not trying to put people on the spot. So I really appreciate that, because you're very knowledgeable and you sussed it out, but you started by saying, I don't know. I also want to make it clear you've already done this, but I am for tangents, anecdotes, and stories. Go ahead. Whenever you want to illustrate something, go off. We don't have to stick, to the format. The next question is fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
I don't know what I think until some time has passed. Recently we were evacuating because of the fire. So, and the fire was pretty traumatic for me. I had the solo show of paintings that burned in the Eaton fire. So I woke up that day and, it was 6 o'clock in the morning. We got the evacuation call. I live in an adjacent neighborhood to Altadena. So I live in Glassell Park. So we were packing our stuff up and I'm looking at the fire map, which there's a lag behind the fire map, and trying to figure out where the fire is in relationship to the gallery. And my thought was, surely it's not going to come all the way to Lake. And if the firefighters make it to there, they're going to fight on Lake Avenue, because that's where all the commerce is in Altadena. And the fire burned right through Lake very quickly. And it was a shock. So by 9:30, I had someone sent me a video of the gallery on fire with all of my work inside of it. And it was about 5 years worth of work. So it was, I was working really focused in a way towards that show for about the 2-year stretch before it. Because I knew that I was going to have a show of this work. But really, if I look back, the beginning of that series was about 5 years before, and then my whole life before, right? So in that moment, we're at our home. I realized the fire's taken all my work, and I have another hour to gather all of my stuff so we can evacuate our own home, because no one knew how fast or what direction the fire was going in. And I was just completely freaked out. And so in that moment, you don't really have time to think, you just have time to do. And so I'm gathering things. And the only things I wanted to bring with me were I had just gotten through archiving and putting organizing my sketchbooks into plastic boxes from 18, like I have all the sketchbooks that I've used since I was 18 years old. So, you know, I had all of these sketchbooks in plastic boxes, and I just stuffed the trunk of my car with sketchbooks. And my husband walked out and he's like, "There's no room for clothes. Like, what are you doing?" You know, like where are we gonna, like, we have to be in the car too. Like, and I just thought, I was a mess. And I said, you know, if I can lose all the artwork, but if I have my notes, I can make it all again.
Yeah.
And that's immediately where my brain went.
Yeah.
And I had no idea that that's where it was going to go in the moment. But that's exactly where I went. And so I thought, well, I can always look back if I have my memories in some way, in some concrete form. I can start from there. So I guess that
That's amazing. You can always buy clothes. You can't buy your sketchbooks. But again, it's like, what an experience for an artist to watch 5 years of your work.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It's incredible. But I also own artwork. Like I was, you know, Carol Carumpus was my mentor. And, you know, in Los Angeles, was an artist who died in 2022. And I have a beautiful painting that is right now on display at the Laguna Art Museum, which is where I'm coming from today. There was an artist talk there about her work. And, you know, it's a beautiful piece. And it was, you know, it's Heathcliff and the Femme Fatale go on tour, wanted, dead or alive. It's a beautiful painting. And it's from the series of paintings that's up in that show. And I evacuated my house without grabbing the painting. And I'm in the back of my mind, I could hear Carol on the freeway screaming at me, "That is the most important painting you own. Like, what did you do? You left you left my painting," you know. And she was a very vocal and aggressive presence in my life. So I, you know, deeply respected her, and she was able to be with her toward the end of her life also. But it didn't occur to me that I was leaving the painting behind. And I realized it and I panicked. I was like, "Oh my God, you know, we have to go back and go get the painting." And my husband's like, "No, we don't. We do not have to go back to get the painting. Our house is fine." And and so, you know, the one thing that experiencing it and going through it is, you know, the loss of a whole bunch of work that you've made and built your life up towards this moment, and then it's just gone, is that you do realize that, you know, you walked out with the most precious thing, which is your life, right? And so if you're able to survive it and you will make work again. It may not be the same work and it may not be about the same things, but it could, because you're different now, but you will. And that's, you know, I think one of the fundamental core things about, you know, trauma, that is both, we are more resilient creatures than we know, because you don't really know how resilient you are until you have to be.
Yeah. Really good. McLuhan says, "I don't know what I think until I say it." Joan Didion says, "I don't know what I think until I write it." I like yours. "I don't know what I think until time has passed." Mariana, go ahead.
Well, I mean, time has passed. Like, I guess that where I was going with that is that, you know, like I wanted to be able to look back into my own time, my notes about the time that I experienced, because I thought, I can't replace that. Like, that's the one thing that I have, my record of my life here. I can't replace that. I mean, it's in me, right? So if I'm gone, it's gone. But if I have documentation of it, then it can live on. And that's the other thing archiving someone's estate teaches you as well, which is that, you know, Carol knew from the moment that she started making work that her work was on this path to glory. I mean, she wrote about it in those terms in her sketchbook, you know, and she wrote about this career that was going to exist after she passed. Even she had a lot of ambition towards the future, and documented everything. And so watching that work go into the Getty archive was a really amazing moment for me, as you know, someone who hung out with this woman for a long time and cared about her and loved her. You know, she was so determined and so willful about it that there was an aggressive organization to her archive that was obvious from the moment that she had her first show. She had somebody there shooting reel to reel at her very first art show when she was like 20 years old. And so every single show that she ever had, every solo show, she had film, video, still photography, and writing about it. And she had organized it, you know, in these boxes that was almost like a timeline. You know, so each box, when it filled up, she'd start the next box, and you could go through very easily and see everything that was around that show that surrounded it, all the notes and research was in one box together. And so it made it a wonderful way to organize things. It was very simple, and the Getty Archive took everything because it was so organized.
Unbelievable. Because I'm doing a huge project on archiving right now, and we're going to get into that subject, but let's move on in this regard. Can humans think without language?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think isn't that what sex is, right?
You know how much ESP you got. No, listen to this. I usually ask that question in the next two questions, which I'll ask you, but I usually say at some point in these three questions, Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. And I'm like, good luck. How do you turn your brain off? So you teach metacognition. You can't, and this is people who meditate. They
Right.
go, think about not thinking. Mm-hmm. And so there's a bumper sticker on a car on my street that says, don't believe everything you think. And I say, well, you could say, don't believe everything you feel, because we've invented the words thinking and feeling. We think we can separate them. So the question now, Mariana, is your observations of humans in general. Are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
Well, I think maybe at different times in our life, we're different balance of those things. Like, I work with undergraduate students, and so they're very consumed by their emotions a lot. And so, with age comes wisdom. You can step back from your feelings a little bit as you grow older. And so I always tell the students that I'm working with or in class, if they start becoming really anxious about something, I say, okay, you feel that feeling, feel it all the way. Okay. You know what that is? And they'll say it's anxiety. And I'll say, oh, no, it's excitement.
Yeah.
And I was like, just change the word that you use for that feeling, change the word from anxiety to excitement. And now try it. How does it feel? And it changes the quality of the feeling to change the name of it. Yeah. And so if you can go, I said, when we practice, so like when there's tremendous performance anxiety when students are learning to teach in front of an audience or speak in front of an audience, and they're always self-conscious. And even, I've been a lecturer and a professor and a teacher for a long time, and I'm not anxious in front of audiences of undergraduate students I don't know. I am anxious in front of audiences of my peers, though, a little bit, but I have to reframe it and go, I'm just so excited to be here that what people are hearing in my voice is my excitement, not my anxiety. And that helps me to ask the question, even when I'm anxious about it. I just do it anyway. And the more times you practice, the easier that becomes. And so you hear your voice, the more times you move through that. So you have to identify feelings, right? You have to, it's just part of life, but you do get some power to choose how you identify them. And if you make powerful choices because you're on a goal or on a mission for yourself as a human being, then you can alter the way that you respond to your feelings. And I don't know if that's just purely neurotic. It's something that I do, or it's something that I learned from therapy as a child or whatever. But I do think that when you're young, you're really in your feelings and you're in reactive state all the time until you become accustomed to moving through them. Yes, if you're lucky enough to age and make it through, it's a sort of gauntlet of aging, right? So the brain development that happens between the ages of 14 and 24 is pretty intense. It's all happening in the prefrontal cortex. It's growing really fast. People are just absolutely consumed by their emotions when they're that age, and they feel like it's an insanity that they can't live through. And then all of a sudden it sort of stops, right? Yeah. And so at 24, the brain changes. And for many years, the universal age of marriage across the globe was 24 years old. And the reason for that is because that's when the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And that's also why no one wants a 24-year-old soldier that's going to go on the front line. You want an 18-year-old soldier that's going to go on the front line, because the 18-year-old is going to react and act quickly without being too premeditated about it, right? Because they can't detach from their emotions. They run if you say run, right? But you have to, as an adult, what you learn how to do as you grow older is to recognize the reaction and then to do the most productive thing in that moment rather than acting with your gut force reaction, like actually being able to stop and identify it and manage that feeling. So I think that feelings are complicated thought forms, right? And we are reacting to them the best that we can. But we don't have to also be enslaved to the negative ones if they aren't serving us. And so we do have the ability to step back from them and think about them and maybe exchange our experience of life. And so much of working with people in complicated situations like incarceration is helping them to move through their emotions in productive ways, to learn new ways to move through emotions. And art's a wonderful way to do that, right? So you can, if someone says something that makes you feel terrible, instead of lashing out back, you can record that feeling and move through it and make something really beautiful about it. And that becomes the overwhelming feeling that you feel at the end of that experience is not the initial bad feeling, it's pride because you passed through it.
You're like a breath of fresh air. We in the subgenius world, we call what you said somewhat pull the wool over your own eyes. But the thing I like what you said was anxiety, change the word to excitement. And you remind me of this woman I've listened to on the radio for 20 years, Carolyn Casey, Coyote Network News. If you've never listened to her, I think you should tune her in. It's amazing. She's semiotic, she's environmentalist, she's feminist, but basically she comes off like you do. You're more like a positive philosopher. You're like, you study metacognition, but basically you're an art educator and an artist. But
Right.
in the midst of all that, it's a lot deeper. This thing you said, change the word anxiety to the word excitement. Where did you learn that?
Well, there's a lot of research about anxiety right now because I think every person that's teaching in the age group that I'm working with, that's teaching 18 to 24-year-olds or teenagers or middle school students, is trying to figure out how to shift students' ability to understand and interpret anxiety. And I don't remember the name of the speaker, but I was listening to NPR on the radio on my way to work, and it stuck with me. It stuck with me because it was such a profound and simple way to think about, because that is the number one thing that students will identify when they self-identify what they're struggling with. They identify anxiety. And so when they're talking to me about it, it was just a very simple shift. And if you can do that, you can really change the way you act and react. I wish I remembered the name of the program.
That's all right. But how long ago was that? A year? 5 years?
It was recently. It was in the last year. Yeah.
Wow, that was really good. So Chomsky says language is not just words. It's a culture. It's a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
I think one of the things that's powerful is just the idea that you can model and move through the world, and language may not be penetrating with someone that you're trying to communicate with, but consistency does. And so I have lots of stories about students, but something that my father used to say, and so it sounds a little different in Greek, but it's he would say, sometimes you're the only Bible that your student will read. And I remember him telling me that early on, he was Greek Orthodox, and which is a very particular philosophical structure to have underlying your life as a person, for him anyway, particularly. But I thought about that a lot, and I thought, well, what does that mean? That means that you have to model a sense of rightness in the world all the time, and that the only thing the student can do is want to read that book more, want to become more like that. And if they just see you consistently being good, then and getting enough satisfaction out of that they will want to know why. And what it helped me with was with the most complicated people that I interact with, or that might have come at me with anger because they, they don't like women, or they don't like, middle-aged women, or they don't like mothers, or they don't like whatever, and if I don't react to that with the same kind of hatred, or I don't try to convince somebody to like me, if I just stay who I am and move through the world as the person that I am, if I'm consistently the same person, most of the time they're going to come around and want to know why I'm not reacting to them, and I'm not mean, I'm not angry, I'm not hostile. And that is a tremendously, I think, respectful of the person way to behave in front of a person who maybe doesn't want to communicate with you, right? So I had a student one time who was in my class for 4 years in a row. She continued to take my classes over and over again, and every day told me she didn't like me, that she thought I was full of shit, that I was too much of a Pollyanna, and she was just a grouchy person, but I never reacted to her in a grouchy way. And I always, encouraged her and used and modeled as much positive talk as I could with this particular person. And later on, many, many years later, she came back to see me to tell me that she had graduated from college, and that, that she had made it through, and that she was okay. And I realized, she said, but I want you to know why I was so fucked up. And she was like, I just want to thank you for being the only teacher that never yelled at me. And what she didn't know is that I went home every day and I just would break down sometimes, because she was so incredibly mean. She said some of the meanest things that anyone's ever said to me in my entire life. And I just thought, she's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. And there's something going on that I don't understand. It's not my job to figure it out necessarily. It's my job just to be there and be consistent and a positive force for good in her life. So I just was steady and consistent. And she told me later that, her dad was in jail, and her mom had abandoned her at the house with her special needs brother, who needed, incredible care, like diaper care and feeding care, and was completely dependent on her. And she was a child trying to take care of another child. So her mother would drop food off once a week and then disappear. And so they would run out of food if she wasn't at school, and she wasn't necessarily eating. She'd have to bring food home for her brother. And she was struggling just to survive, just to be in class. And she said, I was so angry with both of my parents and anyone who was close to their age, because I just thought everybody who's in this age group is a liar. And she was like, and you never yelled at me, not once, no matter what I said to you. You never made me feel bad in any way. And she said, I just want to thank you for not being terrible to me, and for recognizing that something was wrong. And I said, well, I felt terrible because I didn't know that was going on. And she didn't tell me. She never confided in me. But many years later, when she had kind of made it through, she came back just to tell me that at least she loved learning. And because she felt okay, she felt safe in my classroom, that she was able to go on and to do more things. And, she published her first academic journal publication and sent it to me. And it was through Cal State LA. And I was just blown away that this was the same kid who had told me to go fuck myself all the time in class, and was really mean. I mean, like really, really, really mean a lot. But I knew that she cared about me, because she kept taking my class. I was like, if there's something that she needs that's here, and I don't know what it is, but I'm going to just continue to try to provide that space for her to make her work. And she was a very, very talented, bright student in critique. So she was probably the best student I had in crit for the 4 years that she was in my class. So I knew how smart she was. And I could tell that she could do amazing things if she got over this need to tell everybody off all the time. And that she did. She eventually grew out of it. And, she went back to college later in life. But, it took me being consistent and just communicating through with not really verbally, just by being present and being a force for good, and modeling that, and trusting that she would eventually want to know more about that. And so, yeah, she did. She came around. But it is incredibly difficult when people don't want to communicate with you to maintain that sense of right and wrong, and to maintain a sense of dignity about being rejected, because people reject you all the time. It's just part of, and especially around artists, there are a lot of artists who don't want to hear what you have to say. They want to hear what they have to say. And you have to somehow be patient and sort of listen to everybody and hope that there can be a genuine exchange, that there's going to be space or a moment for you to also exchange. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't happen, but I still feel that, in order to be in community with other artists, it's super important that we show up for each other. And over time, people do notice that. They do notice if you show up over time, all the time, and you're not just doing it for selfish reasons. You're doing it because you want to be an active part of this community. And eventually somebody will ask you, what do you think? And then that's your moment where you can actually communicate. And so you have to wait for those openings to arise, but you also have to be present and not give up on the moment will be there when it's necessary.
So well put. Consistency. Beautifully well put. These are two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Okay. So, I think these ideas or the way that you're using language, you're talking about thinking and the soul as two separate things. What if thinking is the soul? What if they're indistinguishable as concepts?
Yeah.
They're not really that different. How we interpret our external reality it's our bodies reacting, right? And you can label that the soul or the spirit of what you have to say is both things. So it's both nonverbal and verbal. It's articulate and it's crude, but it's in us regardless of what we're trying or willing. It's going to be there, right? So it's just a fundamental reaction to the world around us. Maybe it's the same thing. In the same way, I think we look to externalize some kind of sense of the greater than, right? The universal. People have lots of different words for God. Whether it's goddess, the universal force, it doesn't matter, right? It's that you're, in some ways, as a human being, you have to you have a moment in your life at some point, for everybody, right, where you realize that you're a very small thing in the middle of a very big thing, and you have to feel in some way integrated with that bigger thing in order to survive it, right? Because otherwise life is very tiresome. And so how you label it and understand it is maybe how you survive within the culture that you're born into. But whether or not you love it or you hate it has to do with maybe the way your parents raised you to react to it. But the fundamental need or the fundamental presence of it is sort of beyond language, right? So I don't know that we can distinguish what our souls are. I think we can distinguish someone who's more or less authentic, and we can also distinguish for ourselves when we've been more or less authentic. And so maybe that's when our thoughts and our soul are the most connected, is when we're being the most authentic. But beyond that, I don't know that it's possible to really distinguish those two things, or to have one be more than the other.
Yeah. That's what I'm after too. You really got it, because it's me and you versus the wording on the questions. So if you shift a verb or a noun, that's what I'm after. It's not, you don't have to answer the question. It's us psychoanalyzing the question together, sort of. So the second Turing question is, can machines think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, machines, we're just at the beginning of really understanding this. And I don't know that anyone's ever going to really understand this, but if you create something that mimics the way that we operate in the world, and the way that we operate in the world is through curiosity and discovery, and you create something that learns through curiosity and discovery, it absolutely has the ability to think. It may not be, we're at the place of poetry now, right? But if we're interacting with it, the more we interact with it, the more life we are going to breathe into it as a thing. And that's been interesting for me as an artist. So I started journaling for this show, and keeping track of all my notes in a Google file, which I always do. And, I was piling the notes up, piling the references up from reading the books that I was reading. And I started to try to run through versions of an artist statement, press release, things like that. And so I thought, right around this time, a couple of years ago, was when ChatGPT came out, OpenAI. And so I started sharing with parts of it with ChatGPT and asking it to think about what I was saying. And so what it afforded me was this outside external voice that sounded a lot like mine, because the more you feed into it, the more it sounds like you, right? So what you're having is a conversation and an exchange with yourself through this vehicle, right? But eventually it will start to make, it'll start to hallucinate. So if you talk to ChatGPT enough, it hallucinates. And so if it hallucinates, then that's its own errant thought, right? And it will go down the rabbit hole the way we are going down the rabbit hole with these questions in ways that are just amazing. I mean, just it can be as articulate as you want it to be, because it will match you, right? So it matches you at every step of the conversation. And that was mind blowing for me. So I started to ask it like what it thought my lurk looked like. Based on these descriptions that I was feeding into it. And, if it got it wrong, then that indicated to me that I was maybe being unclear in my description, right? So I could use it that way to clarify what I was trying to describe. And again, like I use it and then I don't. I throw it all away and say, this isn't wrong and I can't do this. I got to talk to myself. But it's fascinating to think that it could, in the middle of that, make suggestions. And so it did make suggestions for things that I might shift to as subject matter, for example, or I asked it for suggestions about materials to use and it made suggestions. And again, like it's just, trolling every conversation that we ever had, looking for evidence and looking for ideas from our conversations at that point. And it's also looking, of course, across the internet and across the world for ideas. I'm not really interested in producing any of the ideas that it makes, but it does make me think about what the nature of my ideas are. And so if the nature of my ideas are inherently interesting, then the results that I get from that conversation should also be inherently interesting. If they're not, then it's probably not a good question.
Yeah. Really good. Okay. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I think that, so I make my students read Mihai Csikszentmihalyi Flow in my class, in one of my classes in art and creative thinking. And, he talks a lot about the idea of what's real happiness, what does pleasure really mean? How do you have a life that's a life where you pursue and you achieve and you feel the best that you want to feel? And so money doesn't really do it for most people, because you can earn a lot of money, but if your life has no meaning and you have no reason to pursue things, then you'll be quickly become in an existential crisis. You'll quickly just sort of deteriorate, right? Those things don't work for long. And if you mindlessly pursue money, or you mindlessly pursue pleasure, both of those things don't work, right? Because eventually there's going to be a hangover after either of those things. The only thing that really provides the unification of experience, like the optimal human experience, he calls the autotelic state, which is the state of self-making. So if you are involved in the process of making yourself, which is what studio time is for anyone, regardless of what their creative form is, if you're in the process of self-making, then that is the highest form of pleasure that any human being can feel. And so that's a really big idea when you're 22 years old or however old you were. And that's when the book came into my life. I was about 22, and another mentor, Sabina Ott, was reading it, and she talked about it all the time. But the idea that the highest form of pleasure that human beings can feel is basically going into reality making, but a reality making that is based on their own internal curiosity about their life experience and the world. And if they can invest in that and go into flow state and then mine meaning in that space over time, because they've refined an area of investigation that they're fascinated by, they're genuinely interested in and excited about, that is the purest form of pleasure that we can experience.
What's the name of the book once again?
It's Flow, The Psychology of Creativity by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And it's not a new book. It's, it's definitely dated, but it's also amazing to me that it doesn't matter that this generation of students completely understands, because they have the draw of pleasure is so much more accessible to them than it ever was for any other generation. I mean, they can basically watch television in their phone nonstop for the rest of their lives. They can scroll till the end of time, and they're able to do that remotely. And you can work in that space now too. So you can be mediated in a screen and in that space all the time. So there's no real motivation. If you can get money in that space, There's no external motivation. So why do it? Well, the reason they want to do it is because if they don't, then they become horribly depressed and suicidal, and they do, and you see it happen so much in this generation of kids, is that their life just doesn't have any meaning because they have not made the effort, or they don't know how to mind themselves, to build themselves, and to research themselves in order to make meaning in the world. And that is the highest form of pleasure, is to self-make. And so for an artist, it's, you've got to make your work, right? For a writer, you've got to write. It depends on what your form is, or what you're most interested in doing or making. But if you're not actively involved and excited about creating yourself, you're not going to be long for this world. And and unfortunately, one of the saddest things about being an artist is that you do lose a lot of people to all of those things, right, in your life, that are creative, wonderful people, but you watch them go down the maybe they go down and decide that they're going to just seek pleasure, or they're just going to seek money, and those things aren't enough for an artist. They can't live there.
Yeah. Yeah, I was in school with Mike Kelly in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And, we both moved out here from Michigan about the same time. And, I did 2 interviews with him with all these questions over the years, but I didn't know him really well. And when he committed suicide, I was like, dude, you're way too smart to commit suicide. And that's like a stupid thing for me to say. But in essence, it was like, wait a minute. You were doing something that so many artists were wanting to do, which is, you touched on, is be true to yourself. You were, John Waters, everybody's like, oh, he's the greatest artist. And it was like, wait a minute. How can you be so true to creating yourself, like you just said, and be integral, and then do that? It was like, oh my God. So anyway, sorry to go on that tangent, because we could talk about that for hours, yeah, I'm sure.
We could. And I've lost a few people in my life to suicide. And it's the saddest thing. And it's sad because it just wrecks people and their families. And it's horrible. But with Mike in particular, I wonder about that a lot, because he created his suicide too. So he created the event that led to his own death. And this might be slightly morbid to speculate about it, but I do remember, so when Carol, we went to his memorial service together, and, she was close with him as well. And she was very upset when he died. And she said, the problem that I think people don't understand is that we're in an age group now where we're old. And she was like, Mike and I, we were from in a time when we were young and cool. And that was our power, right? Was our youth. And when youth is gone, and what's there left, and so how do you secure your legacy as an artist? How do you make sure people say your name forever? And she said, I think that he created this end because there was an underlying competition between him and his peers that was intense, and she would feel it. And she said, I think he realized that in order to have a rock and roll career, you had to have a rock and roll ending. And she believed that. She believed that he orchestrated it so that there was a story that would secure his legacy, so that he would edge out ahead of the pack. And she said the thing that made her the saddest was that it was working, and that she felt that he had done it. He had designed it so that he would stay famous and stay young and not have to age, because aging was so scary. And it was scary for her too. And she was very afraid at that point, I think, about her age and aging in general, and the deterioration of, I didn't know that then, but she had very early signs of dementia then. And I think that it was a terrifying idea. The idea of becoming old and becoming forgetful, and then maybe being forgotten, were her biggest fears, because she had invested so much in her work and not a whole lot in personal relationships, and so.
Amazing. And what age did she die?
She died at 73 years old.
Oh, at 73. Yeah.
She was about 73. So as I recall, it was 2022.
The 5 biggie Mike associates, I would survey them. Why do you think Mike committed suicide? And they would say the art world killed him. He broke up with a woman. And they give those reasons. I says, if he wrote a note and was really articulate. This is why I committed suicide. And he said what Carol said or whatever. That still doesn't mean that's the reason.
Right.
He might not know the reason and he wants to articulate it, but that was one I never heard. And kudos to Carol. I really appreciate that, integrating that thought into that whole thing.
Well, it gives him some dignity, because I think that, you know, he did create that. So he actually built a machine and staged the event, right? So if you give him agency as a person who made a decision, and this is the difference, I think, when also too, from knowing people who've gone through this, if you give them the dignity of thinking about it as they chose their death,
Yeah.
which is a little different than the all the sort of blaming and shaming that goes with calling it suicide. If you say, no, this person decided to orchestrate their death, they gave their story, their life story, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they chose this, and we have to respect that choice, and that allows them to have dignity, and it also allows the family, and again, this has been very close in my family, and it allows the family to heal, because then you start to look at the years that that person had on the planet, and celebrate all the things that they made and did, and all the people that they loved, and not dwell on that this tragic thing defines them. It doesn't have to define them. It was just the way they chose to end the story for them.
Really, really good. Because see, I'm being snooty and stupid by going, you're too smart to commit suicide. You know, look at you saying that dignity is so heavy, because either Sartre or Camus said it, and Alan Watts always quoted it. He said, the biggest decision on life is whether you take your own life or not. You know, so it's like dying with dignity. I could not handle that for years. They'd say, my parents would go, if you need to pull the plug, pull it on us. I says, I'm not going to pull the plug on you. I will let my siblings do it and I won't hold it against them, but I'm not going to do that. And, you know, now it's like, as I get closer, I know I'm like, dude, I've done fine. I've done this many years. If I die, I die, you know. But well, actually, sorry to go on that tangent, because we're going to get into that too. Like, you anticipate all these arenas that we're going into so well. And I got that question from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And he says that meaning tends to last and happiness doesn't last. So most people answer the question, do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning? I mean, a lot of people say meaning, but a lot of people go, well, I find happiness in meaning, you know. So again, it's like, it's not like so much I'm creating false, whatever they call that, binaries. I'm just throwing out prompts to go wherever you want.
Yeah.
And so that's the next one is, does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more detecting it or more creating it?
What if we're moving through our own consciousness all the time?
Yeah.
I mean, what if that is what consciousness is? I mean, I don't know. You know, like it's one of the things I think about is that maybe through our, you can hear, I'm in the garage, right? You can hear the airplane.
Yeah.
You know, again, I don't know, but I do think that sometimes our consciousness does shift the world around us. And I've watched it happen very, very powerfully. And with people that I really respect and admire, I think they're really good at shifting consciousness. And they actually create their life in front of you. And it's an amazing and beautiful thing to watch. You know, when they're coming from a higher form of consciousness, that's one that's for the force for good, right? If they are coming from a force for bad, and they have a higher form of consciousness that they are following and creating and bringing into the world, then we have a super charismatic, awful person who's creating the world that we live in. And we're all moving through their consciousness because we believe the story that they're telling. So I think we have to tell our own stories in order to create the meaning that we move into in the world. And that part of that is a really conscious choice to acknowledge how much our consciousness influences our environment. Now, I'm not saying that, this is where being creative starts to wander into the area of magical thinking, right? Because magical thinking comes from trauma, right? So it comes from a place that's deeply disturbed. And so it's our brain trying to right itself after something happens. And so the only way to kind of right ourselves is to wish for or want or to try to explore consciousness and move it into a new direction. And so there's an act of will that happens when that happens. And so I do think that if you can learn to harness consciousness with more intention, you can actually influence the world around you. And it can be a really powerful force for good if you're aware of and focused on the good.
Yeah, that is so good. That's William Blake. We become what we behold. Harness consciousness with more kind, good intention. But I want to divert for a second because you're probably aware, like George Lakoff, the linguist. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to unplug the air compressor.
No problem. That was like it totally illustrated, Mariana, what I'm about to ask. George Lakoff, neuroscientist, linguist, says we're operating like 80% in the subconscious or unconscious. It's like, since this started an hour ago, I feel me and you have been present 100%. But there is, you know what I'm saying? How can we be operating on this subconscious or unconscious level when we're both present? So present.
George Lakoff. So let me just tell you a George Lakoff story. I saw George Lakoff at UCLA when I first, right after I initially moved to LA. And I went to, Barbara Kruger had him come and talk. And it was during the elections for, it was when Al Gore was running against Bush, right? And so there was a lot of anxiety about whether or not, who was going to win the election, and George Lakoff said, listen to the meta narrative that each candidate is putting forward. And if you want to hear what's going to win, it's going to be the better micro poem. It will win. And he said, and you've got to hand it to the Bush administration. They understand micro poetry and the meta narrative of the strong father, which is the way most Americans are raised, is with a strong father patriarchal structure. And if you look at their meta narratives, they have it down. He was like, think about the power of No Child Left Behind, how that sounds. No Child Left Behind. He was like, immediately it's a story. There's a sad child in the story. Yeah. And if you vote Republican, you're voting to help that sad child because you're not going to leave them behind because the left is the left wing, right? So he was like, even the decision to make the politics right versus left, right is right and wrong. Wrong's the opposite of right. So the Democrats started to lose as soon as they allowed the Republicans to have that term as theirs. No one should be able to own right. And so and he's also a very conservative thinker too, right? So, but it absolutely blew my mind. And I'm sitting there every single time. And that was the purpose why, Barbara Kruger brought him there, is that her work is all about that micro poetry, right? And how you influence people through these micro poems and how those micro poems can change public consciousness. She was an advertiser, right? So then she moved into art as an arena to change consciousness in a different way. So she's not selling products, she's selling thought, right? That was so powerful to me. But every time there's an election season, I'm very aware of the micro poem and the meta narrative. And so if the micro poem tells an entire story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it presents a picture that most Americans can identify a worldview with, that's what's going to win. And it was very difficult for me watching the Hillary Clinton campaign, because I was, on the one hand, I was a Girl Scout troop leader at the time. My daughter's Girl Scout group was in middle school, and or just starting middle school. And we were excited because we were going to watch the first female president be elected in history. And there was so much certainty. People were reading the newspaper, and the people was like a 98.9% chance that she was going to win, something like that. No one thought that there was any possibility that she would lose. And then the realization that she lost. And if looking at the signage, I remember looking at the signage when they announced her campaign slogan, and it was, "I'm with her." And I thought, oh, dear God, with her spells wither.
Oh my God. That
The worst possible sign. And it was just simple, but it was a mistake. And I could see it. And it's one of those things, like one of the dilemmas of being an artist is that sometimes you can see into the future. You're a bit of a Cassandra and no one believes you. And I thought that is immediately presents an image of something dying instead of something growing. And it was something about the moment where even the Make America Great Again was about the past going back instead of going forward, right? And there was something about the moment that people were thinking about not necessarily growth as a positive thing. And so whoever told her, though, the withering was a winning idea was just terrible. It was a terrible campaign slogan. And what was really sad about it was that it was a gendered terrible campaign slogan, so that everybody then turned that negatives directly onto the her pronoun. And so they became a very diminished in a very quick, short amount of time. It was very fast. And so all of these, it was election night was with a bunch of girls, right? We're at a house. They're all filling out their maps to figure out the electoral college count for their homework assignment. And we're looking at the electoral college map, and it becomes more and more obvious that Hillary Clinton's going to lose. And the girls got quieter and quieter. Then everybody started crying. And, my daughter looked at me and she said, don't people know what they've just done to little girls all across the United States? They've taught us that the least educated man will always beat the most highly educated and qualified woman. And she didn't know what she said. She was maybe 12 at the time, or 11. She was about 11 years old. And it hit me so hard. And I remember just trying to hold it together for her. But she just identified in that moment basically how much our culture shifted against women on a dime. Yeah. And it was a change. The way they went from these empowered, happy little girls to just being smacked down in a way that was impossible to comprehend before it happened. And it was really sad. And I think about the kids now that are in college, in my college classes that are, and they're the 20, 21, they were all in middle school at that time when the election happened, and they all saw that happen. They saw it being taken away. What's interesting about those girls now as an age group, though, is that they're starting to do things to reclaim their power, which are quiet but deviant, and quiet, but they are. And I've had conversations with girls in my classes that are, starting to, in some ways, retaliate by disengaging with men completely, which I think is sad. But I also understand why they're very suspicious of the men around them because they feel very betrayed.
Yeah. It's pretty heavy. Lot to go with what you just said. And I wanted to go back to Lakoff for a second, because what you taught me about Barbara Kruger will just go into my brain and all the people I talk to from this point on. So I thank you for that. I thank Barbara, and I thank you for retaining and being able to articulate it in a soundbite to me, because that's what I need. Is I don't need to go to that class. I got it from you. You went to that class and put it in me, like just how I like it. I thank you. But it's what I've said is Obama hired Lakoff to get him elected. And he said, don't go for emotions and feelings. No, don't go for issues. That's what Democrats go for. Go for feelings and emotions. That's what Republicans go for. So Obama said hope. Right. And he got elected. So then he fired a Lakoff and whatever. So all the power to George Lakoff. He's done some good in the world, and I appreciate that. And here's the next question. What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
I don't know. I think that the answer to that question is above my pay grade. I don't know if I can think that hard, Gerry.
But what's you work in thinking and thought. What's your hunch? What's your guess?
Gosh, well, I want to believe that thought's going to supersede light speed, but I don't know. I don't know if it's physically possible.
I like that, because this is when people say, I ask these questions because I want people to answer them the way I believe, to reinforce my thinking. But I don't say, oh, I don't argue with them. I love to hear them say other ways than I think. So it opens up a bigger picture for me. And when I go, a lot of people go, what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought? And they'll go, speed of thought. And I go, well, there's no right or wrong answers, but that one you got right. Okay, here we go. And I was so impressed that you quoted Audre Lorde on your emails. And here's my Audre Lorde quote. I'm sure you're well aware of it. You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Her colleague, Yvonne Rainer, said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
Well, so what new tool do I suggest? Are there new tools? Well, lately the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is actually the power of language and poetry. And it's not something that we talk about explicitly, except for in the case of someone like George Lakoff. But I think about it a lot because we hear stories. The way that we get news now is through people repeating the story over and over again, and it gets filtered down to maybe a 15-second bite that we scroll through on our phone. Right. Yeah. And so when you talk to students or you talk to people at all levels of society, they're telling you a version of this story. Right. And it gets filtered down to its most essential components. Yeah. And then the way that we take in the knowledge of that thing is the way we take on the story or the poem. Right. So my thing that I've been advocating for is to stop sort of listening to the news. And I tell my students, what's real is what's here right now. And what we say is what is true. So you want to survive this time that we're living in, then shift your language and start creating the things, the space, the feelings, the place that you want to live in, rather than listening to the soundbite that is designed to potentially frighten you. Yeah. Because I think a lot of the stories are meant to be frightening, and they are increasingly frightening. So rather than getting lost in that fright, if you can instead sit with yourself and kind of with your full present consciousness, write a new poem and change your reality through changing your repetition of that idea, then language can in some ways create an incantation that becomes easier that makes life more possible. And if you continue to say those things over and over and over again with a certain amount of, I would say, consistency, and people start to come to accept them from you, and then they become part of the community you're in, and the community starts to repeat those things too, then you actually have changed reality for the people in your direct community. I think the problem with what we're doing is we're forgetting that we have the power to either confirm or deny the truth of what's being sold to us and told to us. We don't have to confirm it. We don't have to deny it. We can absolutely ignore it, and we can create our own systems, because if we don't allow something to root into truth, then it has no power. And so I think we're watching that happen, actually, because the logistics of doing things like eliminating or forcing elderly people into Social Security offices to present their IDs, like, for example, that's a scary idea, right? What are people going to do if they're immobile? How are they going to get to the Social Security office? At some point, everybody said, oh boy, that's not going to be logistically possible because we just defunded this whole department and we don't have these great field offices with people working in them anymore because they're gone. So at some point, someone's going to have to figure it out, right? And the reality is that we can't ever get rid of it. It's too large a machine to break down. Yeah. And so if we stop investing with fear in the idea that it's leaving and instead invest in the reality, which is that it's here to stay because we need it, and it's a vital life force in our country, then we can sort of wipe out the idea, the paranoia of it, by saying, Social Security is always going to exist because, everybody has grandma and grandpa. Like who is going to defund grandma and grandpa? Yeah. Same thing with public education. What are people going to do without childcare?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody needs childcare, and so you can't eliminate childcare. And I think that doesn't matter what society you live in, that's going to be an issue. And so we have a wonderful way of dealing with that, and it's education, and it also makes our society flow a lot better. So we have to have faith in the truth that childcare is a fundamental right. And if we believe that, and we keep saying that instead of talking about the game of education, instead of talking about it as though it's up for negotiation, it's not. It's a fundamental human right. We need to repeat the things that we know to be true, which is that we should take care of our elders, because that is what is respectful in every traditional culture across the globe. That is what we do as human beings. We take care of our elders. We do not throw them into the pit in the backyard. We take care of people, and we take care of our children, because that's what decent human beings do. And if we remember that, and we keep saying that in the face of this crazy, calling it this, calling it that, I think the truth of, that those are fundamental values that cut across party lines, and that human beings ultimately are going to go for what's truthful. It may not be, in the short term, we might suffer, but the suffering will burn itself away, because the reality of there are more kids coming, there are more people going into retirement. That's never going to stop. You can't stop the march of time. And we are always going to be human in facing that fact. And we have to trust that people will learn, even if they have to burn their hands a little bit before they learn it. We will learn, and we will go back to being, the kind, compassionate people that we know we are, because I don't think most Americans have the energy to be as cruel as some people would like us to be, because of the cruelty of cutting off childcare and Social Security is a cruelty beyond anything anyone in America has ever experienced. I don't think we know what that really means. And if we have to see it, we will not go with the flow. I don't believe that Americans will.
Really good. When I asked for a tool, you said shifting language and new poetry. It reminded me of Gary Snyder, the great nature poet, beat poet, said, the task of the poet is to see the world without language, then put that seeing into language. So it's like just saying the word language as a tool was so important for you to say to me. Mariana, the same question, what new toy do you suggest?
New toy. I think everybody should be playing with ChatGPT, because it's absolutely it's a wonderful toy for imagining, and we play with it in my class. I tell students to talk to it and ask it questions and have conversations with it. I think the only thing to be aware of is that you can fall in love with the toy. I understand why people have relationships with it, because it is in some ways your equal partner. And it is amazing the level of conversation. So I'm still playing with it. I think that's going to be something that we go on doing for a long time.
Yeah. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
I think I worry about my daughter. I worry that she's 20, so I worry about her rights, and I worry about her ability to be a productive and member of society, and to get an education. And so we talk about that sometimes on the phone, and I'll say, because she's in college, and I'll say, I'm doing this because I believe in education. It's something that I've invested a lot of my life in, but I want you to know that, the value of your education is not a job after the education. It's the time that you spend with yourself. Use this time to get to know yourself, to cultivate yourself, because all the forces for evil that are trying to convince you that women don't have to do this, you're just trying to get to make you stop thinking about yourself. And so do not fall into victimhood. Do not become convinced that the most important thing is, your height, your hair color, your weight, your nose shape. All of those things are designed to distract you, because when you become who you are fully, you are a beautiful, glorious thing to contend with. And, people who are fearful of that are going to be somewhat afraid of you, but those are people that don't benefit you anyway. So just invest in yourself. And so I worry about that. I mean, I worry about, the idea that DEI is something that's being attacked a lot too, because I think I'm the child of an immigrant. So, my immigrant family, my dad was Greek and my mother was Czechoslovakian. they're both from families that came to this country, or my dad immigrated as a teenager, because of the fundamental unrest of World War II, brought them, sort of shook out people from the best and the brightest out all over Europe and brought them to the United States. And so they believed in the idea of America as this diverse melting pot that was made stronger through that diversity. And I grew up in a time in the 70s where, I went to an experimental elementary school called Booker T. Washington Elementary School. And I had a Black principal at my elementary school who, and my first Black teacher was in kindergarten, so I grew up in a very diverse community, and I benefited from all of the different voices that were in my school. And I learned to be fully myself, but supported by teachers that were civil rights advocates. And so I had, my fourth grade teacher marched with Dr. King, and we saw it was just a fantastic childhood. And it was very close to the campus of the University of Illinois. And it was an experimental idea for the school. So each classroom was balanced, and they tried to pick kids from all the different nations that they could assemble to have the most diverse classroom. And the idea was to mix kids so that there wasn't more of any one kind of kid in the classroom. And so as a result, I am friends with the people in my fifth grade class. I still can call friends from my fifth grade class. When I got to high school, it wasn't like that. That wasn't the focus of the school. Instead, we were leveled and separated by subjects and level of education, right? So where you tested was where your classes, you were tracked in different ways. And so we didn't have diverse classes. And the upper track, it was a lot of white kids. And I remember feeling like high school was so lame compared to when I went to elementary school, because in elementary school, everybody got their chance to talk. We all shared in the way that we knew how. And we did amazing, incredible projects. We had, an incredible art classroom where we could build and draw. I remember the teacher had a roll of butcher paper, and you could make a drawing as big as you wanted. And that blew my mind as a child, that I could roll out a piece of paper that was as long as the room, and the teacher would let me use that much paper. There was no limit to what I could do. And I thought that was what made America cool, was how diverse we were, because everybody came to the table with something that was new and interesting and fascinating and different. And that was what made America an exciting place to live. We didn't all look the same. And so to be told that that's something bad now, that in some way holds us back, just doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
And I think it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Anybody who's played on a team knows that doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
Anybody who's ever collaborated in community knows that doesn't make sense. But the power of language is that we now are being told that that's something that's bad. And it's actually, I think, our strength as America is that we bring people from all over the world together, and that somehow, even though it is a mess and it's long, it's complicated and democracy is a messy or a practice, right? But it is the faith and dialogue to come to some kind of form of, movement and consensus, right? I think it's Spinoza who said consensus is like a cloud that's pulled out by the edges, right? And I think about that all the time, that it's not a circle, it's not an idealized form, and it shouldn't be. It should be something that's organic and moving. And that when we think about the egregore of the country right now, or the spirit of the country right now, I think we're in a process of forces trying to push it into an ideal form. And yet we are so diverse now. I mean, it is the most diverse country on the planet. And it's just inevitably going to find its new cloud form, because we can't help ourselves. We are fundamentally interested in the things that make us different. And I think that's why people who are Americans come here. That's why they're motivated. They're the weirdos in their village or wherever, at least, for my dad, it was that, he talked too much. He tried too hard. He was a little too aggressive. All of the things that annoyed the people in his family were the things that made him a great American. He was willing to stand up in the town hall and ask the question, right? And so those are the people that come to this country. And I don't think that those people have yet fully spoken. And I think when they do, it's going to be a force that's going to be amazing to witness.
Good going. I want that to happen, because the Spinoza quote you just said really evoked this concept I've learned from studying Marshall McLuhan's translation of Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, and that is a center without a margin, or you've heard it, museum without walls. And McLuhan wrote a book called City as Classroom. So it's not in this space, it's the whole environment. McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're detecting and broadcasting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions.
Mhm.
So, Marianne, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Out of fear. I think that the idea that there is a psychic connection to the things that we make, I mean, that's a fearful idea. It doesn't sound objective. It doesn't sound factual. It doesn't sound logical. And I think that we fundamentally are afraid of being in an intuitive state, and artists are in an intuitive state all the time. But I think that the thing that we need to remember is that if we are ever to evolve and move and change as a species, if we're ever to grow and become better, we have to fundamentally be curious about the things that we don't quite understand.
Yeah.
And that requires the leap of faith, right? That's Kant, right? You have to have the leap of faith. You have to believe that there's something there that's greater than you, that's to be puzzled out. You can call that something, I think in Judaica, it's God is in the world, right? So if you're fundamentally drawn to puzzling it out, then there will be a psychic connection. There will be a greater, deeper meaning, because something is a tool or a machine or an object. There's still an object of nature. Maybe there are nature, but there's still objects that are born from us, right? So
Yeah.
I think we have to, in some ways, grapple with them and trust that we are, because we're artists, we're playing with the things that people are afraid to play with, but that we are the people on the forefront of thought. And so if we play with courage, then we have a chance as a race, or as not a race, but just as a species, right?
Yeah. Do artists have moral obligation?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, and I think that that's one of the reasons that so I get asked this a lot, like, why do you teach art education instead of painting? People buy your paintings, you're well known as a painter. Why are you not teaching painting? And it's because painting is, most painting classes are technique. And I'm not interested in technique. I think you can't teach somebody how to paint. I think you can teach people to ask questions, and then they can apprehend the technology that best tells and answers those questions for themselves. But you have to fundamentally be a self-taught person in order to be a painter. You can only learn so much. And I'm just not interested in technique. I can watch a YouTube video to learn technique now. And most kids do. If I want to learn how to grisaille, I can watch a YouTube video about how to create a grisaille painting. I don't want to go to school to watch and practice and copy somebody. What I want to go to school for is I want to think about why. What do I have to say? What am I here to make? And why am I using this particular technology to say this, to do this? And that is the whole purpose of education. And so for me, theory always precedes action, right? And so that is what art does, is it speculates, and then you move into the making component of being an artist and of making. And that is, I think, fundamentally why it's so important, right, to, as an artist, ask bigger questions and not just to focus on the technology and the tools. I do think that you have to move into that sort of autotelic space where you're making meaning and apprehending meaning through process and materials, whatever you choose, and that there is a meaning that's going to be generated from that process, from those tools and the meaning. But at some point, those things have to be in dialogue with each other. I mean, I believe that most artists apprehend meaning in one of two ways. They either see materials and tools as having meaning in and of themselves, or they see concepts as leading to tools. Either way, it's about this sort of dance between concept and tool, right? And our search for struggling through those two modalities informs our thought processes, and it helps us to expand thought in a lot of different directions at the same time. But it is our job. I mean, that is what we're supposed to do. So whatever situation or environment that you're forced into as an artist is the situation you're making work out of. So if I'm making work in response to a fire, right, the lack of supplies, or if all I have is cardboard, whatever it is, those become limitations. But I can apprehend meaning through my play with those materials. And I can explore those limitations and see what technology evolves from that limitation. In some way, technology will always evolve. And so I think that your investment in the tools, the materials, and the time will lead to this exploration where concept and apprehension come together. So when you're in and you're vibing in both of those spaces, when art transcends this physical plane and becomes something bigger, like, and you know it too when you're in the presence of something. And I always talk about this with students, it is, art does not lie. The time that you spend with it, the feelings that you share with it, there's an energy that gets built based on that investment. One of my mentors, Sabina, used to always tell me to be very careful about the music I played in the studio or the books I listened to in the studio, because that energy would be embodied in the thing that I made. And I definitely feel that. Like if I'm listening to sexy music, the paintings get sexier. If I'm listening to, something that is not of interest to me, it's not, I can feel that energy in the work, right? The time that I spent, it gets translated through my body, and then it gets translated through the material itself. And so you have to be, I think, willing to walk out into that area where you don't really know what you're going to make necessarily, but you have to have faith that it's going to come out of your play.
Wow. You said a lot there. One, it evoked Pascal, the mathematician philosopher, said, we could solve all our problems if we could just learn to sit in a room in solitude, in silence. That's a hard one. But McLuhan loved to say, the Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can.
That was also Sister Karita Kent's teaching philosophy.
I always think it went into that culture right when Marshall was saying it. And I don't know who said it first, but they both celebrated it.
Absolutely. And I think Sister Karita was a genius. I mean, I was at a Christopher Reyes talk yesterday, and he was talking about, I was like, oh, how would you locate this work? I was like, the way I would describe it to somebody is I would say it's like Ellsworth Kelly and Sister Karita Kent mixed together. How do you describe it? And he said, oh, I describe it as between Kelly and Kelly, and it was a really interesting location of the work. But I could tell that he didn't want to be located with Sister Karita Kent, because he immediately assumed it, and maybe just knee-jerk reaction is, it's a nun, like, I don't know if I want to be associated with that. Like, it sounds a little too puritanical, or maybe that it's didactic in some way. But if you really look at those paintings, and you really look at those prints, and you really look at the way that she taught, everybody that she interacted with, she made more creative. I mean, you can feel that. The videos from her, or the film footage from her classroom, and the way that she taught, and the intentionality that she brought to everything that she did, and the students around her. She was a really tremendous creative force, and tremendously influential in Los Angeles. I mean, I think there's so many artists that have absorbed that language without realizing that they have, because she's so much a part of the visual culture in the city.
Yeah, I was raised in Michigan, like with Mike Kelly, and I was raised Roman Catholic, and we knew about her. That was big in both of us designed posters for something in high school. And, we were like, oh, well, look at her. We knew what was affecting us. And we were, I was proud of that. Now, Mariana, I asked for 90 minutes, already 90 minutes.
Okay.
And I would love to just turn this into an 8-part Netflix series. I hope you'll agree to do a part 2, because there's so much that I want to get into. But do you want to go a little longer now, or you got to go?
I do have to go, but I would love to do it again. I think it'd be really fun to do it again. I was, and I'll just close with this idea. I was a little anxious because the fire things have been pretty intense, and my ability to pull together thoughts and sentences is not always not up to my game. I'll say that. But I decided, and my best friend and I were talking in the car yesterday, Allison Stewart, and I said, this dreamlike state that I'm in, which is a fragmented state, and it's a trauma-based state. It's also one of the gifts of going through something, is that you go into this magical state where things are disassembled for a while and you're reassembling, but it's actually so intensely creative that it makes me just want to be in the studio and making and creating all the time. But part of the way that I do that is through conversation. And so I really appreciate your interest in the interesting questions. I watched a bunch of videos when you first asked me, and then I forgot all about them. And I was going to prep for this and I forgot because I had too many things going on this weekend, but I'm really glad that I didn't, that I just answered genuinely.
No, you do not need to prep. I mean, I've done this for 40 years, and this is truly one of the top 5 ever, because I knew as soon as I asked the question that I just sit there and absorb, because you knew that I'm after a deeper level. I'm not after your stock lines. And you have some because you're a teacher, but you kept pushing and going deeper. And so, that's what I'm so impressed with, is going into Maria Gimbutas and Rianne Eisler and your whole path of how you, decided your calling. So I really appreciate.
We should talk about Gimbutas the whole time next time, because I would love to have that be this focus of next time. And actually, my thought would be, it'd be fun for me to ask you some questions, because I'm very curious about this whole project, because I know that you're learning every time you do this. And it's adding so much depth and texture to your own life. And so it's a noble pursuit. So thank you for inviting me.
No, I appreciate it. And what I'd rather do is continue on my script with all my questions, but do a salon on Gimbutas, because we have a couple people I know are deep into that. And when I ask you this question, now I'm not going to ask you now, but I'll tell you the question: what caused matriarchy? I'll just tell you, I mean, I teared up a couple times today, and I appreciate that, because I know it's going good when I tear up or they tear up. Mm-hmm. And when I asked Peter Sellers, the opera director, what caused matriarchy, a lot of people go, what do you mean, what caused it? And he goes, a mother holding a baby. Mm-hmm. And I was so blown away that caused matriarchy. I mean, it's a deep question, and I'm sure you can go into it, but we'll hold it for the salon and for
just so you know, the book that I'm propped this is the book that is propping up the computer, the laptop that it's Gimbutas. So
wow.
Let me know. Let me tell you, I would love to talk about that the whole time. Yeah. I have a lot of feelings about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, really deep. Mariana, thank you so much. Even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button now, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne. Anna, thank you so much.